I recently heard someone speak about being freed from the tyranny of the urgent. And it resonated because when we take a step back, very few things in life actually demand our immediate attention. The whole concept of being freed from the tyranny of the urgent means escaping the constant pressure to address immediate, seemingly urgent and important tasks at the expense of focusing on what really matters. I'm pretty sure we all fall into this trap at times. I certainly do. But I have it on pretty good authority that, believe it or not, the world's not going to collapse if we don't answer every email, every text, every phone call within 30 seconds of receiving them. That pull is very strong, though. And you can literally spend all day keeping busy, whether with office tasks or just life stuff, without actually doing anything meaningful. But this isn't just a workplace efficiency issue or a life prioritization issue. This is a spiritual issue. Because the reality is that we're just not as important as we think we are. Which doesn't mean that we're not of great value to God. We have been, all of us, uniquely and marvelously made in God's image. Even me, even you. But when our worldview turns everything we encounter into something urgent, into something that must be done immediately, we lose perspective. Consciously or not, we begin to see the world as something that revolves around us. And it surely does not. So our tendency to turn everything into an urgent matter is an addiction of sorts. We desperately crave that feeling of needing to be needed. But it's also a theological issue because it puts us at the very center of the universe. It turns us all into essential workers, to use a phrase from our pandemic days. And again, in the grand scheme of things, our tasks and machinations are just not all that important. Whatever we do or fail to do, the earth will still spin on its axis, the sun will rise and set, the moon will wax and wane. But I also think there's great freedom in the realization that everything doesn't depend on us. It helps keep our lives in perspective. It reminds us that it's the relationships that matter. Relationship with God, relationships with loved ones, relationships with our fellow pilgrims on this journey of life and faith. All of which is to say that Sabbath time to rest and renew and actually be freed from the tyranny of the urgent is an essential piece of living a faithful and meaningful life. As we heard in our reading from Deuteronomy, God speaking through Moses couldn't make it any clearer. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. And I think these two things, putting ourselves at the center of the universe and our failure to regularly take time away from those non-urgent things in our lives, go hand in hand. So when we fail to allow space in our lives for Sabbath rest, it's to our spiritual detriment. Sometimes I think we ignore this commandment about observing the Sabbath day because we don't think it actually applies to us. I mean, come on. We're busy. And not only that, we take great pride in how busy we are. Our busyness feeds into our ego, into our feelings of self-worth and self-importance. I'm needed. People depend on me. I couldn't possibly stop to smell the proverbial roses, we think. And boy, that old Protestant work ethic thing runs deep, doesn't it? The guilt we feel when we're not being productive, when we're not multitasking, when we're not getting things done. We may not all have type A personalities, but a lot of us are at least a B+. Maybe you've seen the t-shirt that says, "Jesus is coming, look busy." As if Jesus is only going to reward those of us down here doing busy work, running from one seemingly urgent task to the next until the clock runs out. But remember, taking time each week to rest is not just an optional suggestion, it's literally a commandment. God commands us to rest. And I think God added that one to the list along with the murder, adultery, lying, and the rest, because God knows just how lousy we are at resting. But if you think about it, even God rested on the seventh day after creating the world. Granted, that probably involved a ton of multitasking. But when he was done, God rested. And even Jesus himself modeled for us the importance of Sabbath time. He regularly took time away to rest and to pray, often up on a mountaintop. And so if even the creator of the world, and if even the Savior of the world can take a day off now and then, I'm pretty sure we can too. By the way, can you tell I'm really preaching this sermon to myself? One of my so-called growing edges, and a growing edge is simply a rebranded weakness, I think. But one of my growing edges has always been taking a Sabbath day, taking a day to reflect and renew and rest. I mean, I take Mondays off. I always have. And unless there's a pastoral emergency, I generally avoid going into the office. The problem is my phone. Constantly demands my attention, some of which is warranted, much of which doesn't actually need immediate attention. But some does, I tell myself. I've thought about why it's so hard for me to disconnect. And I think that maybe a small part of me doesn't really trust God enough to take a true Sabbath day. I mean, if I'm not occasionally checking emails, everything might just fall apart, right? Forget that if there was an actual emergency, Susan or Joe would certainly be able to reach me. But God commands us to rest. God commands me to rest. God commands you to rest. God invites us into Sabbath rest, which is more than just watching Netflix while eating Cheetos and scrolling through social media before bed. Sabbath rest is a reminder to stay connected to God. Sabbath rest is a tangible symbol that we are placing our trust in God. Whatever else is swirling in our lives or in our world, Sabbath rest reminds us that God is the constant. That relationship with God roots our very existence. Sabbath rest reorients us to the source of all creation, back to the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Sabbath rest frees us from the tyranny of the urgent by beckoning us to more fully trust in the God who created us, the God who loves us, the God who daily sustains us. So how do you make time for Sabbath rest in your life? How do you leave space for your ever-deepening relationship with God? Maybe you're great at this, but perhaps, like me, you occasionally struggle with engaging in the deep, renewing Sabbath rest that is so vitally important to the life of faith. But I hope you'll join me in always striving to better heed the call, the commandment to Sabbath rest. It is one of the few things in life that truly is urgent.